Good morning, everyone. All right, so I am really excited to be moderating this panel. My name is Dehlia Umunna. I am a clinical professor of law here at the law school and the faculty deputy director for the Criminal Justice Institute, which I always refer to as the premier criminal defense clinic in the world. I am excited to be here today moderating this panel on a topic that's really, really dear to my heart. Before coming to Harvard 10 years ago, I was a public defender in DC, and part of what I loved most about being a public defender was really looking to see how you impact and change lives of people who otherwise couldn't afford excellent advocacy. So it's been a driving force for me in terms of how I practice and really how I live my life. It's also an honor to talk about this topic because I am a mom of two incredible teenagers, Black teenagers, living in today's world who happen to be here early this morning. And so excited for them, but also given the current political and just really the temperament of how things work in this country, also anxious for them. But I will start off because we have such talent on this panel. I am so excited. It was giddy all week, just because of the esteemed panelists that we have. So let me just tell you that we're being recorded. The structure for today will be, I will do brief introductions of our panelists. I have some questions that I will ask them that I hope that they will answer, and then my goal, because I really want us to have a fulsome conversation about reforming criminal justice in America, is to open it up to you, to the panel, to the audience, and take questions. So the stuff that's on your heart that you would like to hear their perspectives on. So why don't we get started? And to my immediate left is Ms. Price, Ms. Kathleen Price, right next to me. She's an attorney she's a cooperating senior attorney at the Equal Justice Initiative. Her work confronts the disasters of excessive punishment and over-reliance on the penal system. Since 1997, she has worked on behalf of death sentence prisoners, other offenders who have been subject to excessively harsh punishment, and communities marginalized by poverty and chronic discrimination. Following a clerkship with Justice Fred L. Banks of the Mississippi Supreme Court, the bulk of her career has been spent with the Equal Justice Initiative. She continues to litigate on behalf of individuals, advocates, and before legislatures and other policymakers, and serves as faculty at training seminars on the death penalty and related topics. In addition to her direct legal assistance, Ms. Price provides consultation and educational assistance to various stakeholders in the criminal justice system. She's a 2014 Harvard Law graduate. I'm sorry, she
I am that young.
I haven't had my coffee yet.
Oh dear.
Let me backtrack. She teaches in the American Studies Department of Columbia University in New York, where she received her BA in 1992. And in 2004, Harvard Law School awarded her its Gary Bello Public Service Award. So welcome.
And I'm from Denver.
Go Broncos.
Yeah.
Okay. Seated right next to Ms. Price is the former Attorney General of these United States. And if you ask me, boy, do I wish she still was the Attorney General of these United States. She's the first Black female Attorney General in United States of America's history. Think about that. Loretta Elizabeth Lynch was sworn in as the 83rd Attorney General of the United States by Vice President Biden on April 27, 2015. Her priorities as Attorney General included national security and terrorism, combating human trafficking, cybersecurity, and improving the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Ms. Lynch received her bachelor's with distinction from Harvard College in 1981 and a JD from Harvard Law School in 1984. In 1990, after a period in private practice, Ms. Lynch joined the United States Attorney's Office of the Eastern District of New York, located in Brooklyn, New York, in the city she considers her adopted home. There, she forged an impressive career prosecuting cases involving narcotics, violent crimes, public corruption, and civil rights. In one notable instance, she served on the prosecution team on the high-profile civil rights case of Abner Luma, the Haitian immigrant who was sexually assaulted by uniformed police officers in Brooklyn Police Precinct in 1997. In 1999, President Clinton appointed her to lead the office as United States Attorney, a post she held until 2001. In 2002, she joined Hogan and Horston LLP as a partner in the firm's New York office. While in private practice, Ms. Lynch performed extensive pro bono work for the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, established to prosecute those responsible for human rights violation in the 1994 genocide in that country. As special counsel to the tribunal, she was responsible for investigating allegations of witness tampering and false testimony. In 2010, President Obama asked Ms. Lynch to resume her leadership of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn. Under her direction, the office successfully prosecuted numerous corrupt public officials, terrorists, cyber criminals, and human traffickers, among other important cases. Ms. Lynch, it's an honor to have you. Be here. Seated next to Ms. Lynch is the Honorable Patricia Saris, Chief U.S. District Judge. And might I say that it's a special honor because at this very moment, the Honorable Judge's daughter-in-law is expecting a child. Aww. My understanding is she's about to go into labor anytime soon, so I promised her that I will hurry this up. Apparently, she also had another grandchild who came yesterday.
Yesterday, I wasn't sure I'd make it today.
So it is the season for babies, for healthy babies. So United States District Judge Patti Saris became Chief Judge of the United States District Court for the District of Massachusetts on January 1st, 2013. She was chair of the United States Sentencing Commission in Washington, D.C. from January 2011 to January 2017. After graduating from law school, she clerked for the Supreme Judicial Court and then went into private practice. When Senator Edward M. Kennedy became chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, she moved to Washington, D.C. and worked as staff counsel. She later became an assistant United States attorney and eventually chief of the Civil Division. In 1986, Judge Saris became a United States magistrate judge, and in 1989, she was appointed as an associate justice of the Massachusetts Superior Court. In 1994, she was appointed to the United States District Court. She's a graduate of Radcliffe College and Harvard Law School, all with distinction. Welcome. And finally, at the end, we have Diana Lucas. Diana, we actually thank you. She is such a trooper. We had another panelist who was impacted by weather, and Diane just stepped right in. So thank you so very much for doing that. Diane Lucas is recently joined the Justice Collaborative as senior counsel, where she works on criminal justice reform policy nationwide. Prior to that role, she was an assistant attorney general in the Civil Rights Bureau of the New York State Attorney General's office. She handled matters in a wide range of areas, including immigration, criminal justice, education, consumer racial profiling, voting rights, and housing and employment discrimination. She has organized a number of political fundraising events and get out the vote efforts. She was the co-founder of 11612, an organization which mobilized voters to re-elect President Barack Obama through the use of fashion and social media. She serves as on the board of Made in Brownsville, a nonprofit working to increase educational and professional opportunities for youth in Brownsville in science, math, and the arts. She also serves on the Ember Charter Board School in Bedford. She is the social action co-chair of the East Kings County chapter of Delta Sigma Theta sorority. I heard some, I guess we've got some sisters in the audience. She received her BA from NYU and her JD from Harvard Law School. Diane, welcome so very much. All right, now that we've dispensed with the introductions, let's get right into what we can do to reform criminal justice in America. And by the time we're done here, we're gonna have our mandate. We're gonna make sure that we accomplish everything that we're setting out to do by way of reform. All right, so let me get to the very first question that I have for you. And actually, I intend to start with the Honorable Judge Saris. So there's been a lot of conversation with regards to whether or not the system is broken. On the one hand, you have conversations about the criminal justice system is broken, and on the other hand, as you have folks on both sides, you've heard folks say the criminal justice system works perfectly. Now, if it's broken, how is it broken? How exactly is it broken? And if it's not broken, what's working perfectly? And how do you see this issue through your perspective as a judge and the chair of the Sentencing Commission?
All right, well, that's a big task so early in the morning. And thank you all for coming, and thank you for inviting me here. I don't think either is true. I don't think it's irreparably broken, but I sure think it needs a lot of work. So the good news still is that, let me just also say, criminal justice, you can't sort of say it with this broad sweep. There's the federal level and there's the state level. So there's often similar, but often very different as well. Let me just talk about the good news, because I'm sort of a Pollyanna that way. Compared to the world and compared to what we really care about, we have the rule of law here. We have independent judges. You still have a jury system, and in that sense, we provide, at least on the federal level, full funding for federal defenders, and in that sense, there's a lot that's working well. But there is a lot that is not working well. And let me start off with the area that I know the best, which is in the sentencing area. And I know a lot of folks here may have more information about how criminal fines are used in the state system and how bail is not working in the state system. But let me start off with federal sentencing, which is, as you know, I was chair of the Federal Sentencing Commission in Washington, D.C., where I had the honor to work with Attorney General Lynch and Sally Yates, and before with Eric Holder and Jim Cole. So this was some area where, at this point, I believe there's near consensus that many of the sentences are too harsh and that too many people have been captured. This is not, I'd like to say this is bipartisan at this point. I don't know whether the current Attorney General agrees with this or not, but certainly when I was working with the Congress, people on both sides of the aisle had come to the conclusion that the criminal justice system punishes too harshly for and captures too many people. And so there is widespread disagreement about whether there should even be mandatory minimum sentences, but I think what almost everyone agrees with in the legislation that was coming through the Congress was saying was at least reduce them and don't make them quite so harsh. And so I wanted to talk about criminal justice, and I'm going to just do it in 2 minutes because there's a big tall order and everybody else is going to have things to say about this. We're a pendulum. It's the 30th anniversary of the sentencing guidelines, but it's also the 50th anniversary of President Johnson's criminal crime task force initiative by, if anyone's as old as I am, I know some of the old lady up here, chaired by a guy named Katzenbach. And crime is a serious issue for this country, and you can't talk about criminal justice unless you understand the impact of crime. And way back then, people talked a lot about rehabilitation, and that fell off the radar screen. It just fell off, and it became much tougher in the 80s and 90s. I think we were freaking out as a society about murder rates and drug rates, and we just kept going up and up and up, particularly with respect to crack sentencing, which had this horrible adverse impact on, particularly on the minority communities. And I think we're coming back down again about, all right, we really do need to think about rehabilitation. We really do need to think about drug courts. We need to think about the collateral consequences of crime. And so, you know, we almost, and I'm curious what Attorney General Lynch said, we almost hit legislation last Congress. It was so close to reaching some sort of consensus on both sides of the aisle. Didn't quite happen. And I'm still hopeful because I'm a hopeful person and because I'm having two new grandchildren. If you don't have babies and aren't hopeful, I'll just give it up. So, but I do think it is in fact true that a lot of momentum was made under Attorney General Lynch and under President Obama, and I don't think we've lost it all. But there was a setback, but I think we're still moving forward, and that's my quick whirlwind here.
Actually, I think it's a logical then to go to you, Attorney General Lynch, to follow up and answer that question as well.
Sure. You know, again, I'm going to agree with Judge Saris and say that I wouldn't posit it as either broken or working perfectly, because I think you have to ask yourself, what is it designed to do in the first place before you can analyze whether it's working at all. And one of the problems that I have seen, having been a prosecutor for a number of years now, at many levels. I was a line assistant in the 90s. I was a supervisor in the U.S. Attorney's Office, a U.S. attorney, and then had the privilege of serving as the Attorney General. But is watching all the different things the criminal justice system has expanded to cover that aren't necessarily criminal, but are disruptive in society. And because we have no other way to handle certain things, mental health issues being one, being the most important one, it all gets pushed into the criminal justice system. So a lot of the issue, I think, is defining what is the criminal justice system, what does it cover, what should it cover. But to the more immediate issues of criminal justice reform and the efforts that we were undertaking several years ago, Judge Saris is right. We were very close to making significant changes in the statutory framework that cover narcotics offenses in the federal system. That's primarily where the heaviest sentences lie. You'll find life sentences for homicides at the federal and state level, and people tend not to disagree with those. But when it comes to narcotics offenses, which have a variety of ways in which they come about, you had this incredibly harsh system that got set up in the 80s and 90s. As the judge said, in large part, a response to the crack epidemic, in large part a response to the violence that followed the crack epidemic. And people seeing that the only tool they had was a hammer, they began to use that for everything. The benefit of time that I've always found is that you can look back and see what happened when you did something. What happened when we did this? When we instituted mandatory minimums for drug crimes without any differentiation as to the role of someone in the offense, as to their background, as to how they came to be involved in the offense. What you found is that everyone is swept into this in a system that was, if you go back and look at it in legislative history, in the 80s, was designed to deal with what people call drug kingpins. No one disagrees with the view that we should look at people who are running large-scale drug operations and deal with them seriously. But when everyone falls under that rubric, when everyone can't be a kingpin, and then those of us who were in the field in the 90s, I became a prosecutor in 1990, began to see that the people who get caught up in the net are not really the kingpins. It takes a lot of time and effort to work your way up to that level. The people that you catch are the lower level, the small fry, whether they're muling drugs, carrying it from one place to another, or driving it someplace. Yes, a serious crime, but they aren't the leaders. They aren't the head of the organization. Sometimes they're being used. Many times they do know what they're doing, but really, they're not Pablo Escobar, who was the leading Colombian drug dealer in the 80s. And so a lot of people saw back then that we were hitting too harshly people who really who weren't intended to be caught up in that. So you always have a system, I think, where have an issue of how do you ameliorate or moderate a system that works in very broad brushstrokes to deal with the individual nuances of every case. So the efforts that were underway several years ago had their genesis decades ago. In the 90s, people recognized that, when I'm sitting in Brooklyn and I'm prosecuting someone who has smuggled drugs in from Nigeria or Pakistan, either in their luggage or in their body, does it make sense for me to give them 10 years in a federal prison when they aren't the leader, they aren't the organizer, they might have made $200, their life was at risk, some of them have died in that process. Does it make sense? So the seeds of it began back then. And when we looked at the crack cocaine disparity, at one point, you look at a sentence for crack and a sentence for cocaine, the disparity was 100 to 1 for the same product. They're manufactured differently, but it's the same product, the same use. But the distribution network for crack was primarily urban, it was inner city, it was primarily Black and Hispanic. The distribution network for cocaine was and still remains at a slightly higher socioeconomic level, quite frankly. There are still professional people who use cocaine on a regular basis because they have the funds and the ability to do so without going into the underworld that puts them at risk for being caught. So you have people who are doing essentially the same thing, and you saw this disparity of people who are committing the same type of criminal behavior, yet being treated wildly differently. And I will say that no one in the criminal justice system, whether you're a prosecutor or a defense lawyer or a judge, thought that that was right. No one thought that that was appropriate. No one thought that that's what they came into the system to do. So the seeds that were planted then, when Eric Holder became Attorney General, he was able to really work along with President Obama and many in Congress on reducing the crack cocaine ratio. These were efforts that we were working on in the 1990s that sadly went nowhere. But by the time we had the Obama administration, people had seen the devastation and the collateral consequences of over-incarceration, particularly in the Black community, were visible. They were all around us. And people realized that whatever they intended in terms of accountability, these other things were not what were intended or should not have been what was intended. Now, we were very close. I will say that having spent 2 years in Washington, and a lot of time sitting in front of Congress, explaining either the department's policies and priorities or why we should change certain things. There was many a time when I thought, I sort of missed the days of sitting across the table from a murderer and having him explain what he did, because at least they're straightforward with you, and you know what you're dealing with. But you come into these different layers of agendas and layers of issues, and you realize that in order to make policy change, you've got to sort of understand the different levers that operate at that level. And one lever that we were able to leverage fairly well was the economic lever. The sheer economic cost of incarcerating individuals, whether it's for drugs or murder or white-collar crimes, is incredibly high at the federal and the state level. At the federal level, it was eating up the budget of the Department of Justice. The Bureau of Prisons is probably, in terms of employees, maybe 10–20% of the department. The budget, it takes about 40% of the department's budget because it just costs so much. And when you look at what you could do with that money to prevent people from going in and also prevent them from returning to prison when they come out, there are better ways to use that money. So on the Republican side, there was a lot of interest in the fiscal cost, and some interest in the social cost as well, but mostly in the fiscal cost. That's fine with me. I don't really care how you get to a particular end, because there are many, many different issues in this larger overall issue. And so a lot of people were pushing for it as a way to better manage our law enforcement dollars. And a lot of people, again, by a total bipartisan effort, recognized that if we could spend half that money and keep people out of prison, we've won on a variety of levels. We came close, and as is often the case, whenever you're trying to get legislation passed, people start adding things onto it. People start trying to use it as a vehicle to get other policies changed as well. And people say, well, I'll vote for it if you will add this. And we had a faction that said, well, we'll throw our support behind it if you add a specific intent requirement to every criminal statute, which you would think, and they would say, well, it's a no-brainer. You have to intend to commit a crime. And you say, well, what about OSHA violations? What about statutory rape violations? So there's certain things that we've decided as a society there should be criminal liability for on a strict standard. And so you don't want to unravel all that. Well, can you resolve that? Maybe. Then, to be completely honest with you, you have your quote-unquote friends in the Congress who say, this is great, it doesn't go far enough. We want a perfect bill. And I will tell you that if you try and get a perfect bill passed in Congress, you'll be where we were at the end of the administration. And that's not to criticize or blame anybody, because I think you have to push for everything to raise the issues and get them included. But trying to get things passed has gotten harder and harder on a variety of levels. And so we were never able to really reconcile what came out of sort of left field and right field at the end of the day to get a critical majority of that. Now, the current Attorney General was a senator at that time and not a supporter of criminal justice reform. He still is not a supporter of criminal justice reform. But what's interesting about that, and for however you think of the current AG, look at him as an example of that mindset from the 80s. You have to understand that thought process if you're going to deal with this issue and if you're going to come up with a solution to change that mindset or work around it. And so I say that I'm not quite sure where it's going to go in the current administration. There are still pushes for it. The same people in Congress at the Senate and the House level, both Democrat and Republican, still want criminal justice reform, both for the social issues and the fiscal issues. But you come up against this, as I said before, this almost 1980s mentality of we have to use a hammer or no one is safe. And that's the rhetoric that you see as well. And it's challenging. But we were able to get the crack cocaine ratio reduced. It's not 100 to 1. What is it now, 18 to 1?
18 to 1.
18 to 1. Completely arbitrary, by the way. Senator Dick Durbin tells the story of trying to push this through to get it down to 1 to 1. And then Senator Sessions would not move. And Senator Durbin tells the story of talking to him, I think in the Senate gym.
The Senate gym.
And saying, Jeff, what would it take to get you to move on this? And Senator Sessions goes, well, I could go to 18 to 1, but not 1 to 1.
Where did he pull out 18 to 1?
And so that's what you ended up with. And that's not perfect, but that is so much better than what we had. And so from a policy point of view, I would agree with taking that win. We then had a whole massive effort within DOJ at the federal level to work to redo a number of sentences that had been imposed under the old system, and some people were able to get out, and then we had a clemency project and a whole host of other things as well.
And I had about 3,000 people are still there because it was not made retroactive. So then you have, so there's a whole host of issues and agendas that come through. You've got the politicization of this issue, which is very challenging and fascinating to see. When you go to Washington, having been in New York, sort of working with people on the practical part of it, it's a very different world. But I would not lose hope for criminal justice reform. It is something that I think people are still working on, somewhat under the radar. Whether or not White House involvement is a positive thing for that or has been positive remains to be seen. There's some people in the White House who still want it, some people don't.
But that could change any minute with this White House. So I sort of ignore them and look at people who are actually working to get things done.
Thank you. So, Ms. Lucas, the same question, but with the added layer of your work with young people, with juveniles, and how this question of whether or not the system is broken impacts them particularly.
Yeah, so I have to respectfully disagree. The system is broken. When you look at a system that is supposed to rehabilitate people, it's supposed to deter criminal activity, and the idea is that they're going to return to society, so that we should be investing in less prisons and more things that would help people to, one, not enter prison, and when they are in prison, to get out and be members of society who are able to vote and who are able to get jobs and are able to get licensing. And I think it's really important to think about how we are an outlier in this country and to look at the statistics when we talk about the system is broken. What does that mean? So we all talk about the United States being the most carceral country in the world, and it's the most punitive. When you look at our neighbors in the West, in Western Europe, we incarcerate 4 times as many people as they do. 70% of people in local jails have not been convicted of a crime. When you look at racial disparities, African Americans are incarcerated at a rate 5 times as many as white people. And when you look at who is in prison, so people of color, blacks and Latinos specifically, make up 32% of the population, but they make up 56% of who are in our jails and prisons. So I say all of that to say that it is important to acknowledge that the system is broken, but I also agree that we're in a very exciting time. Criminal justice reform is definitely happening. There are exciting things happening throughout the country. There are grassroots movements like Black Lives Matter, Color of Change. There's organizations that have been around for a very long time, like NAACP and ACLU, and then there are prosecutors and public defenders and other agencies and governmental organizations that are coming together and realizing that we need to do something. So there's movement happening. But I want to go back to the system being broken for a second. One of the main things that is highly problematic and actually leads to mass incarceration is the criminalization of poverty. So there's been a lot of discussion about the dire need of bail reform. When you think about the fact that someone could sit in jail for years, not convicted of a crime, solely because they cannot pay for it, that is a problem. When you think of fines and fees, there are many jurisdictions in this country that are running because of fines and fees on poor people. So fines and fees are costs that occurred when you are convicted of a crime, or it could be a civil matter, and that money is being used to fund government activities. And so when you think about that being broken, it runs the gamut. I could talk all day about how it's broken, but I really wanted to highlight those things because we have a very serious problem. And I was watching the documentary The 13th, and I remember Brian Stevenson from EJI said that if you looked back at when slavery was happening in the law, the land in this country, and thought, why didn't people speak out? Why didn't people say something in that moment? He said, think about that right now. Like this is that moment now with criminal justice. And so it's really important that we do that. And so what I'm doing now, I actually don't work with juveniles. Oh. The Justice Collaborative is a nonprofit organization that seeks to dramatically reduce the incarceration rate in our country. And what we do is it's pretty unique and bold. So we do 2 main things. The first thing is in our advocacy role. So what we do is we put legal experts in local communities to work with local groups, grassroots, and established organizations. And we look to see what are the drivers of mass incarceration. So we do intense research, we speak with organizations on the ground, determine what those factors are, whether it be bail or excessive sentencing, and we see who are the agents that have control over that, and then we lobby for change. So to give you an example, there's one jurisdiction that we were working with in North Carolina. And there, in order to get diversion for a grand larceny charge, you have to pay to get into the diversion program. And just to explain what diversion is. So if you complete this diversion program through the court system, which would require you to go to court periodically, maybe meet with a counselor. If you complete that program, your case is dismissed, so you avoid a felony record, and you avoid prison time. In this jurisdiction, if you could not pay to enter this diversion program, you go to prison, you get a felony conviction. That's on your record for the rest of your life. So what we did is we worked with some of the organizations on the ground there to help elevate what was going on. So we highlighted one particular story at first. Is this man who, blue collar, he worked at an audio recording studio. He was charged with stealing equipment from his job. He had no record. He could not afford to pay to enter this diversion program. We worked with local reporters to get that story out, and of course, once the community learned about it, they were outraged. So they raised money to pay for this individual person's diversion program entry. But we realized, obviously, the problem is bigger than this one person. So we start working with other reporters, we start working with academics, we're continuing to work with the organizations on the ground who've been there for a long time working on this, and we amplify the message. So all of a sudden, you're getting these stories about having to pay to play for diversion from everywhere you look. It's on the radio, it's on the news, you have advocates coming into your office as an elected official asking you about this, gets national media attention, and then that's how you push for change. And so in that case, it was actually the district attorney who determines who is eligible for the diversion program and recommends them. And that district attorney actually reformed the program and modified it so that you don't have to pay to enter into this diversion program. And that's just one example of how we do this kind of reform work. It's really, really, really important to think about what's happening on the local level, because obviously it's the federal system and there's the state system. When you look at how many people are being incarcerated in the state system, if we can focus on what's happening locally, we can dramatically reduce incarceration. So that's the first thing that we do. The second thing that we do is we want to change the narrative when it comes to criminal justice reform, and we want to amplify the narrative. And that narrative is that, one, yes, the system is broken, but we can fix it. And we all are agents of change. So whether you are a judge or a prosecutor or a public defender or someone who's not even in the criminal justice system, that you too can do something about it. So we have a national media outlet called The Appeal, and we use that to tell stories about criminal justice reform happening both locally and the state level and nationally. But then we also have this podcast that I hope that you all download called Justice in America. So it is co-hosted by Josie Duffy Rice, who I'm replacing, she's my colleague, and Clint Smith. And this podcast breaks it all the way down. It basically are cliff notes on the injustice in our justice system. And part of why that was really important for us to do is we want to make sure that this message is widespread and people can understand when we say we need bail reform, what does that mean? And the nuance is important, as we've seen in California. I think we're going to talk about this some. It's not just bail reform. It's how are we actually implementing this reform, and what are the consequences of this implementation? Because if you end up completely eliminating cash bail, and so it's not about how much money you have to determine whether you'll get out or not, get out of jail or not. Even if you completely eliminate that system, you could still end up being detained if the government determines that you are risky. And you could be detained up until your trial. And now you can't even pay to get out. So if a community bail fund wanted to raise money for you, they can't. And this is all before you've had a jury determine your guilt or innocence. This is all before any evidence has been presented by the prosecutor. And these are the kinds of things that we need to focus on, the details, the nuance. So I'll leave it there because I could talk about this all day.
This should really be a half-day panel. I couldn't agree more. Ms. Price, on the question.
Right. Hello. I'm going to answer the question, but I do want to say I'm so happy to be here, and I want to thank you for inviting me. I was at a very different Harvard. This is, I'm speechless. I mean, walking through the halls and seeing, do you all remember the base of it at Hastings? And the public interest people were like down there trying to write some briefs. Yeah, so it's great to be here, and specifically at the Celebration 65. We had Celebration 40 when I was a student here, and as I was telling someone, it was not only one of the most nurturing events of my time at Harvard. It was one of the few nurturing events of my time at Harvard. So I am glad to pay it forward, as they say. Okay, we are here talking about criminal justice reform, which I think is, I'm glad to be here also because I think it's really the subject of our time and really important. The great bulk of my work is in the context of the death penalty. So I work in very serious crimes. Once I had a client who got bail. I think it was. And I will say without reservation that the death penalty is broken. I appreciate what my co-panelists have said about the work that we've done to correct or to generate sentencing reform and to correct some of the perturbations in sentencing. What we're seeing on the death penalty side is a little bit different. There is certainly the usage of the death penalty is coming down for a lot of reasons. One of them is the fiscal concern, which I'm happy with too. I'll take it. It's true. The abstract question of why we as a society want to spend money in this way, I don't see the engagement of that. But as long as people are saying, no, we should stop doing that, like I said, I'll take it. But specifically, I mean, I think, I'm in a room full of lawyers. Most of you probably know sort of the baseline, the basic problems with our death penalty. One is that it's pretty thoroughly corrupted by racism. And so even though its usage is declining, we're still seeing disparities based on race. And they're typically based on the race of the victim. So to sort of break it all the way down, the death penalty is kind of a referendum on whose death matters. 96% of the studies, 96% of the jurisdictions that have a death penalty have been studied for this specific effect, and they've all revealed one degree or another of a deviance, a bias. The second corruption in the use of the death penalty is the way in which it peculiarly punishes poverty. There aren't people who have money who get the death penalty. It's really sought in instances where the defendant is indigent. I mean, there may be one or two episodes in the history of the United States, but generally it functions with poor defendants. And poor defendants, as you know, rely on the indigent defense system. They rely on public funding for their services. Our Sixth Amendment guarantees people the right to counsel and to the assistance of counsel. But when you are dealing with jurisdictions where there isn't a lot of funding for what defense lawyers really need to do to protect their clients, what you see is, for example, in one of my cases, which you may have heard about because the defendant was released recently, Anthony Ray Henton. He served 30 years on death row in Alabama for a crime that he did not commit. And a lot of the innocence cases are kind of they kind of did something else, but they didn't actually commit capital murder. Anthony Ray Hinton was at work. And he was at work. You remember when you had a time card? I don't know if you all ever had a job with a time card. Well, his lawyer never went and got the time card. So we went and got the time card. At that point, he'd been on death row for 15 years. And it still took another 15 years to actually get him released, to get him out of prison. That's a problem of poverty. If he had money to hire a lawyer, if he had money to pay the lawyer to just do some investigation or to pay an investigator, that's what some lawyers do, they hire an investigator, he wouldn't have been convicted. All right, so not enough on anecdotes. I want to respond to two things. The point about, I really appreciate the point about part of why we are in a condition of mass incarceration is because we've asked our criminal justice system to address problems in our society that are not really within the competency of the criminal justice system. And I've been saying, I just appreciate that, because I've been saying it. I thought it was just the defense lawyers who said that. But this is a social problem. I mean, we are going to talk about, I guess, the technical aspects of the ways in which the criminal justice system needs reform. But I cannot leave here today without talking about what we need to do as a community. In addition to the war on drugs and the kind of tough on crime kind of politicization of punishment, I'm going to take that back. I think the politicization, if that's a word, has maybe dovetailed on a separate social zeal for punishment. Wow. And that's a problem. That's a notion of community if you're kind of a communitarian person. It's a concept of society. It's a notion of a social contract, but we need to engage that because we have been punishing people for all of our fear, which is different than punishing people where our safety requires it. And I guess I want to ask of you, I should stop talking. I want to ask of you to be alert to that question when you as you walk through the world, both as a lawyer, but as a citizen, your civic engagement. Like, what is this punishment designed to accomplish? That may give you some reflection. Okay, I'm gonna stop now. I talk a lot.
All right, so I want to ask a question and ask you to respond in a minute or less, because what I want to do after this is open it up to the audience and take questions from them. So we know the prevalence of all sorts of problems within the criminal justice system, whether it's mental health, whether it's the school to prison pipeline issue, whether, as you have described, sort of issues that don't need to be within the purview of the criminal justice system, whether it's bail reform. We know California just passed a bill not too long ago. If it was left up to you, if you had that moment when they say, Ms. Price, you have 3 wishes, what will your top 3 initiatives be to reform the criminal justice system? A minute or less for each of you.
Well, I would be okay with abolishing the death penalty. And I think that what that would accomplish for us is, to the extent that the death penalty kind of skews all sentencing for violent crime, and we would just remove that skew. I would, there are 2 ways to frame this. I wish that all sentencing, and not just death penalty sentencing, required kind of a full scope inspection, examination of why did we have this crime? What brought the client to the crime? And that's a matter of sort of social history, economic history, perhaps the political broad-based social history. I think of, like lead poisoning. But there are lots of things. And we do this or we're supposed to do this in capital punishment in the context, but we don't always do this in other punishment. So I would wish for that. I think, and the flip side of that is we have to, as a system, be invested in understanding that, right? You have to be invested in taking in the meaning of that information in order to fashion an appropriate sentence. The last reform, I think, for me would be a resumption of a community commitment to rehabilitation. or to correction, actual correction. I think that every single one of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. Every single one of us. And I would wish that we had a system that wouldn't throw people away, would stop, that's what I want, stop throwing people away.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right, thank you. Attorney General Lynch.
So if I only had three things, and again, the magic wand, so
Yes.
they might be impractical, I would, the first thing I would try and do is shift the priority balance that we have now from a punitive nature to a preventive rehabilitative nature. Because one of the main problems with over-incarceration is that people are on a path to incarceration in the first place. It often starts, for young black kids, it often starts in school. The school-to-prison pipeline is real. It is a reality. It impacts children of color incredibly harshly. And we're starting to talk now as a society more about how it impacts young women of color as well. The criminalization of the black female body, I think, is something that has to be discussed.
Okay.
So I would try and shift the priority and the focus. Obviously you have to have accountability, but I would try and shift those resources and the focus in our thoughts to how do we prevent someone from going down this route. I would try and expand the focus from this also, from just someone who has done something that has transgressed against society to the fact that we're also trying to prevent harm to society. You know, if we prevent someone from going down a road of criminal behavior, we also prevent others from becoming victims. And we all have a vested interest in that. My second thing, again, if I could do, have had my magic wand, frankly, I may surprise you with this, maybe not. I would focus on the educational system in this country. The number of times I've sat across the table with someone when I was a line prosecutor and put together a case, and whether they were a defendant or whether they were a cooperating witness, and realized that one of the main problems I was having in sort of either assessing a case or something like that was because the person in front of me literally could not read, was incredible. And it has struck me ever since I joined the criminal justice system as how many people who slide through it have slid out of our educational system before they came to me. So that is something that I think, it's not something that we typically put in the criminal justice reform pot, but it is essential, it is vital. Education is the framework for how people approach society, how they interact with society, whether or not they are employable or not, whether or not they have the ability to find resources to help them through their other issues. It is whether or not people's educational level often is carried on by their children. And what we see is that when we put educational programs in the prisons, not only does it help the inmates who were there, but it helps them with their family relations. Whenever I talk to inmates who had taken advantage of some of the programs we were trying to push through to get a degree, whether it's a GED or a college degree, to a person, to a man or a woman, and it was mostly men I was talking to, they said, this has also helped me be a better parent. And be a better father or mother, because now I can talk to my children in a different way, and you can break a cycle that happens when you incarcerate parents, because you put their children at risk as well. So the educational system overall, shifting the priority there. And I think also I would, if I could do this,
Yes, as your
I would,
third one, yes.
I would remove it from the political agenda, because there we get caught up in these emotional calls that don't really affect safety, but they're shorthand for, a lot of them are racist dog whistles, and they make people feel better, but they don't really make them literally safer. You can lock up a lot of people in this country for a lot of things, and it's not going to stop the next person coming around and creating new victims if you don't address that earlier issue. And so sometimes having it caught up in the political system means we spend a lot of heat and energy and light on that question and not on the substance of why are we in this situation in the first place.
Okay.
So if those are my magic wand things.
Excellent, thank you. Judge Saris.
I'm very clear on what my number one choice is. I would eliminate all mandatory minimums in the federal sentencing system, and state and federal mandatory sentencing. You know, when I was chair of the Sentencing Commission, we reduced drug penalties by as much as we could, consistent with the statutory scheme, and we reduced them by, on average, 2 years, as a result of which 40,000 people came out early. We also reduced the guidelines for crack people. So 40,000 people got out 2 years earlier as a result of this, and we followed them on terms of recidivism, you know, to see whether there was an increase in the recidivism rate. We did this both for the people who got out early on crack as well as what we call drugs -2. And there was no increase in the recidivism rate. We are just simply punishing people too long for public safety. It's not necessary. So it's the other thing is it takes, all right, this is sort of me as judge talking, it takes the power out of my hand and puts it in a prosecutor's hand as to who gets 5 years, who gets 10 years, who gets doubled to 20 years, who gets life. I often, the ones I lose sleep over are the ones where I can't do anything about it. And it's just, I'm not saying that the guidelines are a perfect thing, they're not, but at least right now, the way the Supreme Court construes them, there's a lot of latitude in what a judge can do, both being anchored by a certain, trying to eliminate disparity, but also being able to take into account individual characteristics of an offender. So I'm very much opposed to mandatory minimums. I mean, on the commission, we had a range of views on this, so I'm speaking now on myself, but myself and what I've seen as a judge, both state and federal, that's number one what I do. Number two, what I would do is I'd eliminate collateral consequences of sentencing. One thing I never focused on, I've seen it now, the ALI is focusing on it, as well as other reform institutes, is right now, once you get out, okay, I believe you do the crime, you do the time. I'm not necessarily, it should be shorter time, but still. But then once you get out, what I never realized is that basically, and I watch people now on probation, supervised releases, they can't go back to lawful lives because they can't get into subsidized housing, and they often can't get jobs, and they can't get student loans, and they can't. And licensing even for, was it a barber? I don't even know. So it's, I would just eliminate them. Now, of course, you don't want a pedophile, and you can't vote, and you can't hold public office. I'm not saying I want to put a pedophile in a preschool. I don't. There may be certain extreme situations where you don't want to do it. But in most crimes, it absolutely makes no sense at all. And the third thing, I'm going to just chime in where everyone else is as a judge, both on the state and federal level for now, I hate to tell you, since 1986. So I've been a judge. And I always ask the offender, Christy knows this, she's my law clerk, why did you do, almost, I can't tell you how many, majority dropped out of school early. The majority of people I'm saying, they dropped. Why'd you leave? A, I was bored. B, they threw me out. C, I couldn't do it. So I mean, some had learning disabilities, some were bored, some with this zero tolerance policy were bounced out. Well, once you leave school with marginal literacy, if any, in the ninth, I can't tell you how many people leave school in the 9th grade. Then what is your choice? You're doing what I'll call minor league drug trafficking. The Wire is true. I mean, the TV show. Minor league drug trafficking, small amounts on the street corner in the housing, and next thing you know, you're a career offender, or you're being picked up in a sweep in a housing with mandatory minimum sentencing. I myself have a very simple solution. We should not be allowing children to drop out of school at the age of 16. We just should not be doing that. If maybe they'll go to, you've ever heard of the Benjamin Franklin Institute, anybody? That was actually funded by Benjamin Franklin. But I mean, there are schools out there that don't necessarily, they're not necessarily pre-college. They teach you how, like, to be an auto mechanic, or they teach you how to be a medical technician, or a beauty salon person. But they at least teach you how to earn a living if the school isn't your thing. But right now, we allow children, and I'll say children, to drop out. And they're the ones, ever since that Johnson report in 1967, I sort of was sad that you weren't working with children, because I actually think that's when we should stop this from happening right away. And so I'm going to add number 3, education.
Okay. Ms. Lucas, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions.
Sure, thank you. So everything that this distinguished panel said, in addition to that, I would require that every law enforcement agency and criminal justice leader commit to being an anti-racist organization or agency. And what that would translate.
We're really going to need a magic wand for that one.
You probably need 2 magic wands. But it sounds like something that can never be done, but when you really think about how you can do that in a piecemeal fashion, you can start with doing racial impact statements and looking at legislation that is being considered, and looking at legislation that's already been passed and doing a review of the racial impact. And so states like New Jersey, for example, have this. They do a racial impact statement, and they look to see what is going to be the potential disparities and what are the consequences on people of color and communities of color if we pass this legislation. And in looking at that and looking at data and actually seeing what the harm is, that informs your decision. So at least as an agency that's committed to being anti-racist, you can say, well, if we continue to prosecute these low-level marijuana charges, we're going to continue to have this great disparity. So maybe we shouldn't. And that leads to my second point, which echoes what was also said about the criminalization of social harms, the social ills, I should say. They should be civil. We should not be prosecuting drug possession. We should not be prosecuting, and I will even say low-level crimes like theft. These are crimes of poverty. These are crimes of addiction. It is better suited for the civil realm to be handling these cases, not criminal. And we've seen the criminal justice system has not been able to handle it effectively, and that is putting it lightly. And just really quickly, I just want to add that Rachel Rollins, who just won the Democratic primaries in Suffolk County right here, she has said as a campaign promise that she will decline to prosecute 15 low-level offenses, including drug possession and petty larceny and things like that, because one, it's just not a good use of limited resources, and two, when you look at the disparities, that's really where they are. And so focusing on those level crimes and making them civil, either through legislative reform or just declining to prosecute. And then the last thing is restoring voting rights. I don't think I need to explain that.
Please join me in thanking this very fabulous panel.